It brings a tear to my eyes.
I want to do two things with the time that I've been allotted. The first is to give a very quick overview of our brief at the Anti-Poverty Ministry to SaskForward, relating it to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, who had concluding observations on Canada 10 months ago that included critiques of all the provinces and recommendations for all the provinces. The second is to look at some smaller policy changes that are needed to reverse the present austerity measures that we see relating to income security and housing in the province. I would also like to mention some of the bare minimum expectations that we had coming out of the Saskatchewan Poverty Reduction Strategy, but continue to wait on things that we really expected we would see, but we're not there. But we continue to believe that these are things that are needed to be implemented tomorrow. So at the Anti-Poverty Ministry, we start with the understanding that poverty is a human rights violation. In 1976, Canada, with the approval of all the provinces, signed the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Article 11 of this covenant recognizes the right of everyone to have an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. Article 7 of the covenant recognizes the right of everyone to the enjoyment of just and favorable conditions of work to ensure all workers with fair wages for a decent living for themselves and their families, as well as equal remuneration for work of equal value. Unfortunately, when these rights are infringed upon, there is no domestic remedy in Canada. There is no legislative protection. Since 1997, the Anti-Poverty Ministry has identified key anti-poverty proposals through extensive grassroots consultation with people living in poverty and community groups dealing with poverty issues. The following proposals arise time after time. They are the need for adequate income security benefits, a living wage, quality and affordable housing and childcare, equity initiatives for groups that disproportionately bear the brunt of poverty, including Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, new Canadians, and single mothers. Each of these proposals would ensure basic social and economic rights. And one more proposal with them has been the need for a better distribution of wealth through a system of fair taxation. All of these proposals we've taken through the courts of the United Church so that they have become the official position of Saskatchewan Conference of the United Church of Canada. And each of these concerns were identified as grave concerns by the UN Committee in its concluding observations on March 23rd of last year. Now, over the past 2 years, we have seen the development of the Saskatchewan Poverty Reduction Strategy. Unfortunately, this strategy has neither legislation nor a human rights framework. Since it was released on February 24th of 2016, we have not seen an expansion of social and economic benefits and protections, but instead have seen announced cuts for many of Saskatchewan's most economically vulnerable citizens. What is needed now is a Saskatchewan Anti-Poverty Act, which entrenches the rights Saskatchewan has committed itself to under international law and put them into enforceable legislation. Such legislation is the essential ingredient of an effective anti-poverty strategy and would allow us to once again play a leadership role in pioneering progressive social legislation that is a model for the rest of Canada. Most importantly, it would provide needed protection for our most disadvantaged residents. Now, as I mentioned, our proposals came out of a grassroots consultation, but have been backed up by the UN Committee. And I just want to mention some of the things that they've said on these matters. On the issue of adequate income security benefits, the committee said this: The committee recommends that social assistance rates are increased in all provinces to levels that allow a decent living for beneficiaries and their families so as to ensure an effective income safety net. On a living wage, the committee recommends that the minimum wage is increased in all jurisdictions and indexed regularly to the cost of living so as to allow a decent living for all workers and their families in accordance with Article 7 of the Covenant. On adequate and affordable housing, the committee recommended progressively increasing federal and provincial resources allocated to housing and reinforcing the housing subsidy within social assistance benefits to be commensurate with living costs. It also calls for governments to take effective measures to substantially increase the availability of social and affordable housing units, and calls for regulations on rental arrangements with a view to ensuring that tenants enjoy the right to affordable and decent housing and are not vulnerable to threats of forced evictions and homelessness. On quality and affordable childcare, the committee called on the federal and provincial governments to provide affordable childcare services to assist parents to balance family and employment responsibilities. On equity initiatives, the committee called on the government to effectively implement and improve existing legislation on equal pay between men and women at provincial and territorial levels, including the adoption of effective enforcement mechanisms. It also said that considering the advanced level of development in Canada, they are very concerned about the significant number of people living in poverty, and particularly concerned that Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, single mothers, and new Canadians continue to experience high rates of poverty, and that there's been limited effectiveness to the measures taken to address these issues. On a side note, the Anti-Poverty Ministry strongly supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But we know it doesn't bode well for the declaration that 40 years after signing the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we still don't have any legislation for social and economic rights in this country. For the first time ever, the committee also weighed in on the issue of fair taxation and wealth distribution, saying that they are concerned about stagnation in the levels of social spending in relation to GDP, and that they're also concerned about low corporate tax rates compared with other rich nations, and the disproportionate impact of austerity measures introduced in a number of provinces that affect disadvantaged and marginalized groups and individuals. The committee urges governments to implement a tax policy that is adequate and socially equitable and improves tax collection so as to ensure mobilization of the resources sufficient for implementing economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's the big picture and the larger transformational policy goals that are needed. But what about right now? The first thing that is needed is to fully reverse the cuts that were announced this summer, and then partially backed off on with a grandfathering or grandmothering clause. The biggest of these cuts was to the extra living allowance to recipients of the Saskatchewan Assured Income for Disability program, the SAID program for people with significant and enduring disabilities, people with permanent disabilities. And what there was in place was an extra living allowance. We refer to it as excess shelter benefit, which allowed an additional $150 for people to meet their rents in a rental market where rents were rising quickly. And on top of that, for those communities that had a vacancy rate of 1.5% or less, they also matched reasonable rent increases. And now there's been an attempt to take all of that away, which means that a single disabled person would receive only $459 as their shelter allowance, combined with a maximum rental supplement of $256, for a combined total of $715. Now, there's not a lot of places in Tier A, which are high rental cost areas like Regina and Saskatoon and many northern communities. But this is a problem across the province because there's even lesser rates for rural communities and smaller cities. So even though there's been a grandfathering of this so that people are allowed to keep it if they had it, the problem becomes that new people needing to access affordable housing aren't able to do so. and if there's any change in circumstance, they lose the excess shelter or extra living allowance. So if you have to move for any reason, leaving domestic violence, if your place is substandard and you're looking for somewhere else, or if your rent is going up and you have to move, what you find is you've now lost your excess shelter or extra living allowance. Now, we had some experience with this before it came in, because it was done, they did exactly the same thing to people on social assistance, first in 2012 and then again in 2014. When they did it in 2012, what was particularly or additionally scuzzy about it was that they added overpayments for all the excess shelter that people had ever received, in some cases going back 6 or 7 years. So people are dealing with overpayments between $6,000 and $10,000 on top of losing their excess shelter. So we took this through the appeal process, one at the local level and the provincial level, and we thought that the issue was settled for then. And ironically, this was at exactly the same time that the Assured Income for Disability was being expanded to people living independently. Then in 2014, at the same time that the government was getting into all kinds of warm and cuddly talk about poverty reduction strategies that they were going to be looking at, they went after the excess shelter again for social assistance clients. Once again, we took this to the local appeal level for clients and won at that level. But this time, unfortunately, at the provincial level, the boards, while they agreed that the overpayment should not be held, or that the client should not be held responsible for overpayments, they did agree that the excess shelter could be lost if people were receiving the rental supplement. But many people at that time were told, well, because it was primarily really vulnerable people that were losing it, they were told, don't worry, because you're likely going to soon be on the Assured Income for Disability program, where the benefit will be safe. Well, after 2 years, guess what? So that was the first major cut, and but there's several others that came out of this budget. The employment supplement, which is an additional income for low-income working families, and there's a high proportion of female-headed single-parent families that make use of the program. They decided in 2015 that they would grandfather it for 13 to 17-year-olds. Anybody new coming into the program wouldn't be able to receive benefits for that age group, or if a child became a teenager, they would no longer be able to receive it. That grandfathering lasted 1 year, and then once again in this budget they said, no, now we're getting rid of the grandfathering. So the employment supplement will not be there for 13 to 17-year-olds. Once again, this is something that they backed off on and have grandfathered, but once again, this is something that no new clients nor children turning 13 will have the benefit come into their household, because we know that teenagers are so much less expensive. Another cut was for SAID recipients over the age of 65. And this isn't a large group of people, but for seniors with high medical costs, they were able to access or continue to access SAID eligibility, which meant that they could continue on with supplementary benefits. In this budget, what they decided was that if you're receiving guaranteed income supplement and the senior's income plan, that would go against your SAID eligibility, and so it took a whole bunch of people off the rolls. Now, once again, they have grandfathered that, but anybody new now turning 65 is not going to be receiving this, what we refer to as the health-only SAID benefit for seniors. Now, we've long taken the position that there should be full supplementary health coverage for all seniors, but we're now at a stage where not even the lowest income seniors can receive the most basic supplementary health benefits. Another issue that's arisen has been the expansion of the transitional employment allowance. This is the least adequate form of income security. It's for people that are potentially employable, and we've long called for its elimination, but At least up until recent years, there was a limited number of people that were on it. It was primarily people who were more likely to quickly move into employment. That's no longer the case. Women who are about to give birth are on the program. Lots of people who are dealing with all forms of disabilities are on the program, and basically it's a very clear cost-saving measure, because on the T program all you get is $328 for your shelter and $255 for your basic allowance, which are wrapped together. And you don't even get, unlike social assistance, you don't even get your full utilities paid. There's a capped rate. If you go over that, that's not covered, and there's no provision for special needs. And what's perhaps most ironic about it is that a program called the Transitional Employment Allowance claws back the first dollar that you receive in wage income. So there is no additional wage income that you can receive on the Transitional Employment Allowance. So those were some of the big cuts and changes in the budget. Obviously, we're concerned as well by the recent only 22-cent increase in the minimum wage, up to $10.72 an hour. We've long called for Saskatchewan to be competing for the highest minimum wage in the country, not the lowest. And we see Alberta having a plan to move to a $15 an hour minimum wage, which should be our goal as well, on the way to a full living wage. We're also concerned that one of the key changes that we would like to see sooner rather than later is a change to the supplement, or the rental supplement, because as it stands right now, if every client who receives the rental supplement, or every tenant who receives the rental supplement, has their home inspected, and if it doesn't pass code, they lose the supplement. So it's the tenant and not the landlord who is held accountable for being in substandard conditions. They're forced then to ensure that their landlord provides the necessary maintenance or upkeep, or puts in the disability supports, which is fundamentally unfair. And while we're the first ones to say that there should be either rental unit licensing or an automatic home inspection plan, we do need to de-link the quality and standards question from the rental supplement. And frankly, I mean, if the government wants to talk about streamlining, I don't have a problem with a streamlined program where you have an adequate shelter benefit for everybody, and get away from what they refer to as stacking of programs, but at present means that people are forced into piecing together inadequate benefits to even come close to paying their rent. A few things that we expected to see finally out of the poverty reduction strategy, and we didn't expect that we were now going to see immediately a boost in benefits for people on the Assured Income for Disability or the Saskatchewan Assistance Plan. How much time do I have? Oh, good. But we thought that at this point we would at least start to see an improvement in the exemption rates. Saskatchewan has the lowest wage exemptions for people with disability or on social assistance in the country. If you're employable, you're only allowed to keep $50 of wage income, and then 25% of the rest to a maximum of $200. If you're disabled, you're allowed to keep the first $200 and then 25% of the rest to a maximum of $325. So as I said, this is the lowest in the country. Alberta and British Columbia, for people with disabilities, people are allowed to keep $800 in wage income. We've called as a first step to at least double these exemptions. But there's other asset exemptions that should be allowed as well. And one that really bothers me is that there are caps even on the amount of compensation through residential school settlements or land claims or human rights claims, that once it goes past a certain amount, it's clawed back from your social assistance benefits dollar for dollar. So obviously these were exemptions that we expected. Present austerity measures have hurt most the people who did not benefit from the boom years. In fact, they were hurt by the rising costs, and indeed the boom hurt them. For many, for instance, since 2008, food bank usage has grown by 77% in Saskatchewan, 17.5% in the last year alone. This is a pretty good barometer of social and economic policy. And in the boom years from 2008 to 2013, Saskatchewan had both the biggest growth in food bank usage while also having the biggest growth in millionaires in the country. Obviously, trickle-down economics doesn't work. It is what it always has been, which is suck-up economics, with governments beholden to the corporate elite, allowing wealth and income to be sucked upwards, while income, benefits, and services to working people and low-income people and vulnerable people are sucked away. So I will conclude with that and look forward to further discussion in our breakout session.